He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we're exploring the Abnauayu, which is another variant of Bigfoot. Now, before we get into that, a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, and should you wish to reach us directly, you can do so via CryptidClues@gmail.com. If you've missed these past few weeks, we've been tackling a few encounter tales regarding Sasquatch, and only last week, we actually took a turn into the demonic area with a look at the Smurl haunting. So it's been a pretty good jam-packed month so far, but here we are now turning back into the Bigfoot realm with a look at its Russian cousin. Now, like any good cryptid, it all starts with a legend, taking us back to the 1850s, and a name, Zana. This name was given to a wild woman that is attributed to being one of these Abnauyus. Now, we'll talk more about that later, but this woman appeared pretty much out of thin air, to which a group of hunters managed to capture her. And according to the tales, she was dark of skin and hair, extremely strong, 100% uncivilized. And even after supposedly passing through a plethora of different owners, her habits, they remained primal up until her death in 1890, where she had been actually residing with a man called Edgy Gnaba. Now, she never did learn any language, or as I mentioned, any human habits or traits, I guess. More like the human etiquette is probably the appropriate way to address that. It's reported, however, that she did in fact learn basic chores. Now, on top of that, she even gave birth. 4 of the children supposedly survived into adulthood, the most well-known one being Quit, who lived from 1884 to 1954. Now, the skull was removed from the place of burial in the 1970s and determined upon examination by Grover Krantz, who is a famed anthropologist and Bigfoot researcher, to be human. Now, Russian archaeologists tried to supposedly find Zana's remains, but even though she's buried in a family graveyard, no such remains have been discovered. So while this legend stands, there is still a lot of convoluted and things that don't necessarily align when it comes to the remains and just how this goes. At its core, it seems very convincing that we do have a case of something that isn't necessarily human being passed around to different owners very recently, but we don't necessarily have any solid concrete evidence that this wasn't human and what was really going on here. Now, while this tale is, of course, the stuff of legend, there are some interesting eyewitness reports. Russian professors by the names of Alexander and Boris in the 1960s, now they indicated that the story itself was immensely popular among the local population. Now, a few decades later, in 2009, when filming an episode of National Geographic, this show was called Is It Real? Scientists brought forward the supposedly discovered skull of the Quit, along with another female skull discovered prior, and assumed that to be one of Zana's daughters. Now, upon being brought to New York for a DNA analysis, this deep dive yielded some interesting results, that the 2 skulls shared no resemblance and both were 100% Homo sapiens. So, I wanted to start with Zana because according to legend, it's the closest gateway into what the Abnauayu creatures are. It's worth noting that just because they found the skulls to be Homo sapiens, doesn't confirm in fact that they are the same skulls that we would attribute to being the Quit and to Zana. But, of course, whether or not Zana was indeed Abnauayu is not 100% confirmed in itself. But as we discussed, we do have a lot of documentation regarding this legend, and it was very popular, as I said, amongst the local community. But perhaps that's all it is, a legend. The Abnauayu themselves are described as being very muscular and around the same size as a grown human, which is interesting in comparison when Sasquatch is, well, much taller. Now, these creatures have reddish-black hair, a low brow, reddish eyes, and high cheekbones. While there are indeed sightings of these creatures, and in connection to how Zana could seemingly learn basic household chores as discussed prior, these creatures have been seen using sticks and rocks as tools or weapons. That may come as a shock for some, but chimpanzees, believe it or not, also use sticks as tools for digging, probing, and even weaponizing. Research conducted back in 2007 showed these capabilities, and in fact, with chimpanzees, it's considered to be the first piece of evidence of systematic use of weapons in a species other than humans. An important thing about these creatures, though, is the type of environment that they are known to reside in. When you look at the Bigfoot, Pacific Northwest is just a wonderful place and ecosystem for something like this to live in. We can definitely see how one can take advantage and thrive in such a forested terrain. But with the Abnauayu, we'll take a look here and see if their home is capable of maintaining such a mysterious species. Now, the Caucasus is a region spanning Eastern Europe and Western Asia. It's situated between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. It consists of two major parts. You have the North Caucasus and the South Caucasus. Now, the northern part is basically including Russia and several other republics, while the south consists of 3 independent countries. Now, the mountains in this region are its most prominent feature, with Mount Elbrus being the highest peak in Europe with a height of 5,642 meters or 18,510 feet. And historically speaking, it's been quite the cross point for a few civilizations like the Persian, Ottoman, Russian, and Byzantine empires. In today's world, it's just a tourist hotspot for skiing, hiking, and just a few other cultural attractions. It's also strategically important due to its oil and gas reserves as a location. So, yeah, take that for what it is. The Caucasus features a mix of landscapes ranging from snow-covered terrain and glaciers to densely packed wooded forests, grasslands, and plains that can be further broken down into, like we already said, the mountains, which break off into very deep valleys with year-round snow, lower elevation areas that are still mountainous, but they have more forest and grassland areas. And as we descend further and further, we get into grasslands and plains, and in some areas it becomes much more humid and subtropical, with wetlands and much richer vegetation. So there is a bit of a clash of different ecosystems here, all at different altitudes throughout this region. Now, this wide range allows for many large and medium-sized animals, both in predator and prey categories, to thrive. On the larger side, we have leopards. These are considered to be extremely rare, but they can be found in the more remote mountain areas. Brown bears also reside here in the forests and the mountain areas. Gray wolves, considered to be one of the top predators in the region, and then lynx as well. As for the prey animals, you can find Caucasian turs, which are a species of mountain goat that are found in the rocky cliff areas. There's red and roe deer, wild boar. Much smaller prey consists of hares, pikas, rodents, waterfowl, reptiles, amphibians. In the water spots, you'll find Caspian trout, brown trout, carp, pike, and catfish, to name a few. And being near the Black Sea, you'll find salmon, eels, and much more swimming around out there. So with all this said and done, how well would a large bipedal creature fare in the region? Well, we know the mountains are remote, rugged, and sparsely populated. Even though, yes, there is tourism, it's still a good place for a creature to hide. You got deep forests and cave networks. I've spoken many a time about how valuable cave networks could be for cryptids, and they're riddled throughout this area. Now, the climate being varied, but primarily colder, would allow for something that has a fair amount of hair on its exterior to survive, which the Abnauayu does. On top of the food sources, there are many rivers and streams interconnecting to larger bodies of water, which provides just fresh drinking sources, and like we mentioned before, lots of, well, water-based meals, so to speak. So there's definitely a lot of potential here. Now, considering all those pros, the region is not devoid of cons. Some of the winters can get insanely harsh at higher altitudes, which of course would impact food availability. And the steeper terrain in many places could be problematic. But ultimately, based on eyewitness reports, these creatures and their cousins, like Bigfoot, don't seem to have too much of an issue scaling very steep inclines. Now, lastly, a topic that has reoccurred many a time over with Bigfoot and other cryptids, large creatures in general, heavyweight, with Bigfoot, let's say 500 pounds or more, you gotta understand that there's going to be a high calorie intake here, which again adds credit to the difficulty of surviving long winters. And you have to take into account competition. Wolves and bears will be eating and utilizing the local food sources too. Now, depending on what you believe, perhaps some predators will steer clear of certain spots to avoid such a dangerous bipedal predator. But if the elements are brutal, you'll have predators pick and choose their fights. Conserving their energy, well, because it could be a life or death situation or a decision. You have to really, really make sure that if you're going to expend all of your energy in a run, it's got to count, and you got to get that meal, like a cheetah. Cheetahs have adapted very well to an incredibly competitive environment in order to survive. The cheetah doesn't waste energy or take risks that might cause it injury or threaten its young. When it comes up to a potential food source, the cheetah will actually scan the area to identify any of said threats before engaging in a pursuit. This would be a very fitting attribute to associate with Bigfoot and its cousins, like the Abnauayu, especially because those instances that occur where Bigfoot sees a hunter and the hunter withholds firing at it, maybe that's a case where the Bigfoot is deducing, hey, I could go in and hurt you, but if I do, long term, there's going to be people coming out trying to find you, hunting parties. I don't know if maybe a Bigfoot is fully aware, cognitive of the repercussions of killing a person, because people go missing in the woods all the time. So again, it's impossible for me to say because we don't have an example of this in our history or in science. All we can do is speculate and just take into account the information from sightings. And in these sightings, lots of the times, hunters are scoping out and they see something bipedal and hairy, and it will maybe huff, let them know that it sees them, but will walk away. It will not engage. And I think that could be just, hey, I don't want to get shot. I know you're holding a gun. It could be something there that prompts it to understand this is not worth my time, like a cheetah is able to gauge a situation and see, I don't want to get injured. I don't want to waste my energy. If I'm going to do something, it needs to be, the stars aligned. It needs to work out. But of course, we just don't know what these creatures' rationalizations and motivations are. To be determined. Now, this also isn't Russia's only bipedal Bigfoot creature running around. There are a few other ones here that I'm going to name out and elaborate on their features, because some of them share strong similarities to the Abnauayu, and so ultimately it could be a case of the same creature but different names. Personally, I found no shortage of names bestowed upon these creatures like Bigfoot. It's an insanely deep rabbit hole, which takes us to the Mckenny. Of course, hailing from a different region, nonetheless, we know these creatures travel extensively long distances, and this creature happens to reside also in Russia and western Siberia. 6 to 7 feet tall and covered in shorter 2-inch reddish-brown hair, it has a fairly round head with a prominent brow ridge and glowing red eyes. Again, note the eyes, same color as before with the Abnauayu. It has even shorter hair around its face, ears, and nose. Its neck is pretty much non-existent, with its head sitting on a very wide but very muscular-sized shoulders. It has a very barrel-like chest and has a notable white on its forearm with massive feet completely covered in hair. Most notably, it seems the reported sightings of this creature take place in August. And it's deduced, and I say that lightly deduced, of course, we just don't know 100%, that it follows a seasonal migratory path. It's known to knock on windows, alerting people to its presence. One of the leading Russian researchers on this Bigfoot-like creature, Maya Bakova, she sadly passed away in 1996. Now, she spent many, many years digging deep into this unknown mystery, and she herself had twice observed the Mckenny. In her first encounter, dating back August 16th, 1987, she was basically assisting a family that was dealing with these issues on their property for a very, very long time. And when she was staying at their cabin, a Mckenny had actually knocked on her cabin window at early dawn. She had rushed outside, and most of the family members came out. They had seen the figure standing more than 6 feet tall, leaning against a dead tree out in the distance. After about a minute had passed, the creature stopped looking at Bakova and ran away when the dog started to run after him. Bakova was not alone here, like I said, and there were other witnesses to reaffirm what they were seeing. Now, sadly, in mid-October of that same year, that same dog had disappeared and was eventually found, and this is very inappropriate, skull crushed and its body ripped apart. Bakova's second encounter took place outside of that same cabin on the night of August 22nd. 1988. This is a whole year later. Now, she had met a young man prior to this by the name of Mansi, and he is basically the individual that needed the assistance. His family was having reoccurring issues with these creatures on their property. And that's what led to Bakova coming out here to help in the first place, to see them. And now they spent well over an hour watching this Mckenny in the woods near their cabin, as it was what they deduced, looking for frogs and mice. The next day, they had investigated the area and found large footprints, trampled grass, more indicators of this creature walking around and just kind of creating its own little trails. There is one more name for these creatures that resides in the North Caucasus, which exists in Turkic folklore, with a range that also extends to Central Asia and the mountains of Western Mongolia, the Almasti, or Almas for short. This has been something we have mentioned very loosely on the show prior, but here we're going to deep dive into it a little bit here. So some researchers have made the case that this is a present-day Gigantopithecus. But that's a heavily disputed conversation. Some people suspect it's an actual Neanderthal, just based on the similarities. Now, many of these speculations, I suspect, are prior to what we know about cryptids and varying types of other human species that existed parallel to Homo sapiens. The term Almas is a Mongolian word for wild man, and the plural Almasti is actually derived from Russia. Now, some of the first described historical records for these creatures date back to the 1400s, but even then, it's not necessarily referring to one singular creature, but a community of many of them. While resembling the framework of the aforementioned Neanderthals, the descriptions are much more in line with that of an Abnauayu, bipedal creatures with a common height range of 5 feet tall, but they have thick brown to reddish brown hair on their faces, while their faces are, like the Mckenny, devoid of hair coverage. The skulls of the Almas have a protruding brow ridge with a slanting forehead, a flat nose, and a fairly large protruding jaw. They have very large feet and equally as long fingers with their arms covered in hair, but just like their faces, the hands themselves are not covered. As we near the end of this episode, we're going to head over to 1964, where a Russian historian professor called Boris Porchnev claimed that the Almas appeared to have cone-shaped heads, teeth structures that were similar to humans except that their canines were much wider. A more recent expedition to locate the Almas was led by Russian cryptozoologist Dr. Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann and French researcher Sylvain Palix in 1992. Now, while Dr. Porchnev had reported to have found evidence of tools and communities of these Almas groups living around the Caucasus Mountains, it's still a discussed topic on what these creatures exactly are as we circle back to Zana. Their ability to use tools and think independently while doing mundane repetitive tasks, and of course, after the 1992 expedition, they claimed the information they discovered was that these beings are large, hairy, weighing in over 500 pounds, and primarily operated at night as nocturnal creatures. It makes sense, just like any other real predator. Now, this apparently was able to hit speeds as fast as 40 miles per hour, which is that is quite something. However, the only solid physical evidence that the team found was hair, footprints, and droppings. What is neat here is that the various Almasti names in this region also include the Barmanu from Afghanistan and Pakistan, which Reuben and I did a very in-depth coverage episode on the Barmanu. I highly recommend those episodes. It's number 25 for your convenience on our feeds. So go check that out. Now I'm going to close this out now with an encounter that, while it's not 100% certain what we are dealing with is a Bigfoot or just what we're dealing with in general, it's nonetheless a mystery, and I thank you for sharing it if you are listening. And I quote, "My father was a biologist and had worked for the FDA for many years. He later was a reporter for a small-town newspaper, and in his travels across the states and abroad, he had seen many amazing things. He was definitely a no-nonsense guy and dismissed anything paranormal out of hand, until one summer night when he decided to take a quick trip from the house to the gas station about 3 miles from our home. We lived out in the sticks and had a few people who lived near, but for the most part, all were spread pretty thin. So anyway, my father left to the store, but returned within a couple of minutes. Now, much too short of a time to get to the store or back. He walked into the house and stood there looking at the wall and looking extremely puzzled and nervous. I looked over at him standing there and asked him what was wrong, and if he had even made it to the store to begin with. His response was dead silence. I queried him once more, and then he began to speak to me in a low and quiet tone. I'm not sure, he said. I became even more confused, not sure of what. But I'm not sure what I just witnessed, he replied. So then he told me of 2 to 3 foot bipedal humanoid creatures that began to cross the road slowly in his headlights. It wore no clothes, had no anatomical identifiers, but had human-like features that were distinguished enough for him to identify that it was extremely angry with my father's headlight intrusion. My dad felt in a very real sense of dread from the encounter. Now, we never really talked anymore about it, but from time to time it happened to pop up in conversation, or at least cross my mind, even though we weren't really talking much. And I decided to record it here. It was the summer of 1997 in Asante County by a little town called Oxlip. I do have other stories of paranormal activities in this little area, but it seems to be a hotbed for a few years in the mid-1990s to early 2000s. End quote. I know this is an entirely different area from our main topic here, place of residence, but I was excited to share it because of its aesthetic, isolation, and the fact that it rattled this man's understanding of what we knew. But even in the face of fear, he still was trying to rationalize it. Now, of course, I sense maybe not Bigfoot, but I want to feel like it could be. Again, that is my own very, dare I say, biased kind of perspective. To each his own. What I presented you was this information, and I'm curious what information that pre-exists on your plate that you're already aware of and what you can deduce that this might be. I'm very curious and would love to know. In closing, for me, I think that it's the feeling of dread that this person had, and that's something I feel like it comes with Bigfoot, comes with the territory, I guess. But what do you think it could have been? I'm all ears. And on that note of ears, we are done this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. For Cryptid Clues, I am your host, Taylor. And remember, you can find more episodes in our podcast feeds. And should you wish to reach us directly, you can do so via cryptidclues@gmail.com. So until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.